I stood by the window, barely touching the cool glass with my fingertips. The view of the bay was breathtaking, a shimmering expanse of water draped in a light mist, emphasizing the contrast between nature and the sleek modern lines of the house I had just moved into. This house embodied Thomas, my husband, confident, stylish, untouchable. We had been married for only 3 months, and I was still learning to accept my new life as a reality. Thomas was a man who knew how to get what he wanted. At 48, he had achieved everything he could dream of: a successful career as an architect, the reputation of a perfect gentleman, and now, a new wife. I felt that everything with him would be different from anything I had experienced before. His caring eyes held a strength I trusted, yet something kept me from fully relaxing. Perhaps it was this house, too big, too cold, as if it were built for solitude. "How do you like it?" Thomas's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. He stood in the doorway with a glass of wine, looking at me with that warm smile that had won me over from the start. "It's magnificent," I said, hiding a smile. "But the house? It feels as though it hasn't accepted me yet." "It will," he assured me, stepping closer and wrapping his arm around my waist. "Just give it time, like Lucas." Lucas? The name stirred a faint unease. I knew almost nothing about his son, other than that he lived with us. Thomas rarely spoke of him, as if he didn't want it to overshadow our new life, but I could feel it. Lucas didn't approve of our marriage. Later that evening, I encountered him for the first time in the hallway. Tall, with tousled, dark hair, he moved with that particular lazy confidence of young men who know their worth. He was 22, but his gaze was older, heavy and penetrating, as if he could see right through me. "Good evening," I said, trying to start some sort of conversation. He stopped, tilting his head slightly. His eyes glinted, and instead of replying, he simply nodded before walking past me. I watched him go, feeling an odd chill, as if someone had slipped icy fingers beneath my skin. That meeting left a strange aftertaste. It was clear Lucas had no intention of making my transition any easier. Still, I decided not to dwell on it. After all, we were a family, or at least we were supposed to become one. The house slowly began to reveal its secrets, but instead of warmth, I felt like a guest. Every morning, Thomas left for work, leaving me alone with the silence and the panoramic windows that framed a mist-shrouded Seattle. My only company during those days was Lucas, but it seemed he would have preferred if I didn't exist at all. We rarely crossed paths. Most of the time he was in the garage, working on his motorcycle, or in his room behind a closed door. Sometimes it felt as though he deliberately chose moments when I was in the kitchen or the living room to pass by silently, avoiding even a glance. His presence was like a shadow, quiet, yet constant. One day, I decided to make a move toward him. I knew Lucas's reserved nature was a barrier that needed breaking. When he headed to the garage again, I summoned my courage and followed. Lucas stood with his back to me, hunched over the disassembled motorcycle. Sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated his hands, smeared with oil. I froze in the doorway, suddenly feeling like an unwelcome intruder. "Are you always this engrossed in mechanics?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice light and friendly. He straightened slowly and turned to face me. His eyes held neither hostility nor warmth, just indifference. "It's just a hobby," he said curtly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Did you need something?" "I wanted to get to know you better," I said, stepping closer. "We're family now." A strange smirk flickered across his face. He looked at me as if I had just said something ridiculous. "Family? Funny to hear that from you," he muttered before turning back to his work. I stood there for a few more seconds, feeling my efforts crash against the wall of his indifference. Finally, I turned and left, trying to convince myself that things would eventually change, but deep down, I knew his coldness wasn't random. Something about this house, or about me, was keeping him from accepting me. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I organized the living room and cooked dinner, hoping to show Lucas that I cared about our shared life. When Thomas returned, he thanked me with the warmth that always gave me strength, but Lucas didn't even glance my way. He ate silently and then retreated to his room, leaving behind an oppressive quiet. At some point, I realized something. His behavior didn't just unsettle me, it frightened me. It was a strange feeling, as though beneath his indifference lay something more. Something he didn't want to reveal, but that might already be affecting me. The events of the following days only deepened my unease. Thomas left early and returned late, fully trusting Lucas and me to build a relationship. But each new day reminded me how little I knew about the person who lived under the same roof with me. Lucas continued to avoid me, but his behavior was growing increasingly strange. At times I would catch him watching me, an intent, unabashed gaze, as if he wanted me to notice he was looking. Those looks carried neither overt hostility nor warmth, but there was something in them that unsettled me, as if he were trying to decipher a mystery about me that I didn't even know existed. One evening, while Thomas was working late, I heard Lucas enter the kitchen. I was standing at the stove, preparing something light for dinner, and decided it was an opportunity for us to talk. Turning around, I saw him leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. "You're not in the garage tonight," I remarked, attempting to start a conversation. His presence still threw me off balance. "Got tired of the bike," he replied evenly, watching me. His voice was low and felt unnervingly close, despite the distance between us. "I'm glad we can finally talk," I said, placing the pot on the stove. "We don't get many chances to." He stepped forward, and suddenly the room felt much smaller. His gaze made me take half a step back. "Funny," he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Do you really think we're a family?" I faltered, searching for the right words. "Of course. Why wouldn't we be? We live together now, and—" "Don't fool yourself," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're not my stepmother, and you know it." The words landed like a challenge, daring me to respond. I felt my mouth go dry. "Lucas, we're all still adjusting to each other," I began carefully, trying to maintain composure. "It's not easy, but I believe that, in time—" "Don't," he cut me off sharply, his tone final. "Some things can't be forced to work." He stepped closer again, the distance between us shrinking to almost nothing. His voice lowered, but the tension in it grew. "Just know this. I don't see you as my stepmother, and I never will." I stared at him, unable to find a response. His words hung in the air, charged like electricity before a storm. After a moment, he turned and left, leaving me alone with my confusion and unease. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that he simply didn't know how to express his feelings properly. But deep down, I knew this wasn't mere resistance. There was something too peculiar, too personal about his behavior, and no matter how much I tried to ignore these signals, they were becoming impossible to dismiss. Thomas had a 3-day business trip ahead, and the house grew even quieter in his absence. In the evenings, the only sounds were the wind howling beyond the panoramic windows and the muted clinking of tools coming from the garage. Lucas seemed perfectly comfortable in solitude, but I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me. I needed something to occupy my mind, to distract myself. On the second day after Thomas left, I decided to venture into the garage. Not to talk to Lucas, but to better understand what he was passionate about. Perhaps by seeing his world, I could find a way to build a bridge between us. The garage was much larger than I had imagined. In one corner stood his motorcycle, heavy, black, its gleaming chrome reflecting the light like something alive. Nearby, tools were neatly arranged on a workbench, but my attention was drawn to something else, a large corkboard on the wall above the bench. It was covered with various photographs, magazine clippings, and notes. I moved closer, examining its contents. Pictures of landscapes, vintage cars, postcards from cities, and then I saw something that made my breath catch. Among all these items was a photograph of me. It was a candid shot from one of the events Thomas had taken me to before our wedding. I was standing among a group of people, smiling, but Lucas's gaze in the photo was fixed solely on me. He was in the frame as well, standing nearby, but it was as if he had intentionally chosen a moment where only I was fully captured. "Do you like it?" A voice sounded behind me. I spun around sharply. Lucas stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was devoid of emotion, but his eyes were locked on me, studying my reaction. "What is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "My inspiration board," he replied with a faint smirk. "Everything I like." "Why is my picture here?" I tried to sound calm, though every nerve in my body was on edge. "Why not?" He shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're part of my life now." "Lucas, this is strange," I said, trying to maintain an air of authority. "Do you understand how this looks?" He pushed himself off the doorframe and stepped closer. His movements were deliberate, calm, but his gaze was intense. "And how does it look?" he asked softly, tilting his head. I felt a rising panic within me. Taking a step back, I gestured toward the board. It's too personal. You shouldn't." "I shouldn't?" he interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge of steel. "And you shouldn't have come in here." He took another step forward, and the air in the garage felt heavier, almost suffocating. "You invaded my personal space," he said, his eyes glinting under the dim light of the overhead lamp. "So now I get to ask you the same question. Why not?" I stood frozen, realizing that any response I gave would only make the situation worse. Finally, I drew a deep breath and quickly left the garage, feeling his gaze boring into my back as I walked away. From that evening in the garage, staying in the house became increasingly difficult. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, filled with a tension that was invisible yet tangible. Thomas was still away on his trip, and every morning I woke with the sole thought of getting through the day. Lucas remained as unpredictable as ever, at times avoiding me completely, at others unsettling me with nothing more than his presence. Late in the evening on the second day of Thomas's absence, I sat in the bedroom trying to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred together into meaningless lines as my thoughts kept drifting back to Lucas. I could hear him moving around the house, but I tried to block out the sounds, until there came a soft knock at my door. I startled. Who else could it be? Slowly, I got up and walked to the door. When I opened it, Lucas was standing there. He looked calm, but the same unsettling glint I'd seen in the garage lingered in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "May I come in?" he asked, not waiting for an answer as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sent a chill down my spine. It felt as though there was no way out of this. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. I stayed standing at a distance, unsure of how to respond. "I've been thinking about how to say this for a while," he began, his voice low and calm. "But I don't see any point in keeping quiet anymore." "Lucas, you're scaring me," I said, trying to maintain control over my voice. "What is it you want to say?" He lifted his head, and his gaze pierced right through me. "I feel something special between us," he said. "And I know you feel it too." I froze. At first, his words sounded absurd, but the seriousness in his tone, the conviction, made it clear he believed them. "Lucas, this is insane," I said, stepping back. "You can't say things like that. I'm your father's wife." "So what?" He stood now, facing me directly. His voice sharpened. "You know it as well as I do. We pretend for Thomas, but we both feel it. Why lie?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My body tensed as if bracing for impact. "You don't understand what you're saying," I tried, but my words came out weak. "This is wrong." "Wrong?" He moved closer, closing the space between us until he was just inches away. "Then why does it feel so right?" I raised my hand instinctively, as though to shield myself. "Stop, Lucas. You have to stop this right now. Leave." He froze, and for a moment, his expression softened, as though he'd realized something. But then, just as quickly, he smiled again. an unsettling, tight-lipped smile that sent shivers through me. "You're afraid of this because it's the truth," he said softly. "But it's inevitable." In that moment, I felt as though I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't fully comprehend. I didn't scream or push him out of the room. I simply stepped back, making it clear I wanted no part in this conversation. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and walked out, quietly shutting the door behind him. Left alone, I let the tears fall freely. They weren't just from fear, but from a deep sense of helplessness. Things had gone too far, and I had no idea what to do next. Thomas returned home earlier than expected. When I heard his car pulling into the driveway, I felt a wave of relief, as though the fortress I had been desperately defending finally had reinforcements. I greeted him in the hallway with a strained smile, trying to mask the turmoil raging inside me. "Hi, darling," he said, wrapping me in a hug. "You look tired. Everything okay?" "Of course," I replied too quickly. "Just didn't get enough sleep." But I couldn't hide my tension. Thomas noticed, his sharp gaze lingering on me a moment longer than usual. Still, as someone accustomed to keeping a certain emotional distance even in family matters, he didn't press further. We sat down for dinner, and Lucas, as always, only appeared when summoned. His behavior had changed. While he used to avoid Thomas, he now carried himself with unexpected confidence. It was obvious that Lucas didn't like Thomas being back. Every comment, every remark he made at the table was laced with a strange irony that made my skin crawl. "How was the trip?" Lucas asked, leaning back in his chair. His tone bordered on insolence, though Thomas seemed oblivious. "Successful," Thomas replied, not looking at his son, his focus on his plate. "We signed a contract with a new client. It's a big step for the company." "Great. You've been spending so much time away from home," Lucas continued, smiling, though his eyes were fixed on me. I felt Thomas glance up. "Work requires sacrifices," Thomas said, though there was a note of puzzlement in his voice. "You know that." "Of course I know," Lucas said calmly, raising his glass of water. "It's just that while you were gone, your wife and I grew closer." The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure Thomas could hear it. His brows furrowed as he looked between Lucas and me. "What does he mean?" Thomas asked, directing the question at me. I struggled to find words, but there were none. Lucas savored the silence, as if this was all part of a carefully staged performance. "I mean, we spent some time together," Lucas clarified, his expression innocent but his tone loaded with double meaning. "Is that true?" Thomas's frown deepened, his gaze sharp and probing. "Of course not." I raised my hands as if to defend myself. He's just saying that." Thomas turned to Lucas. "Do you have something to say to me?" His voice was low, a warning edge in it. Lucas shrugged, feigning indifference. "No, Dad, just joking. Don't take it so seriously." But the silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas clearly sensed something was off. I saw the way his grip tightened on his knife, and his eyes settled on me again, unrelenting. When dinner ended, Thomas stopped me in the hallway. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone firm. "What is this growing closer Lucas was talking about?" "It's not what you think," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "He's provoking us. He doesn't like that we're married. He wants to drive a wedge between us." Thomas studied me for a long moment, doubt flickering in his eyes. "Are you sure? Because he's acting like he knows something I don't." "I'm telling you the truth," I insisted, panic creeping into my voice. "Nothing happened." Thomas nodded slowly, but the hardness in his gaze remained. He wasn't fully convinced, and the worst part was that Lucas, sitting in the living room, could see it. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. He knew he had won this round. After that dinner, the house seemed frozen in tension. Thomas, unaccustomed to doubts, had started observing. His usual confidence was replaced by suspicion. His once warm gaze now studied me as though under a microscope. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed energized. He seized every opportunity to drop ambiguous remarks or meet my eyes with a look only I could decipher. On the third day after Thomas's return, the tension reached its breaking point. That evening, I sat in the living room, attempting to focus on an article I was working on, but my thoughts were in chaos. Thomas was upstairs, and Lucas, as usual, was in the garage. I heard him enter the house, and I could almost physically feel that something terrible was coming. "Can we talk?" came his voice behind me. I flinched. He stood at the doorway, holding a mug of coffee, as if this were the most casual conversation in the world. "Lucas, I've told you to stop," I said wearily, without turning around. "You don't understand," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "This won't stop because it's bigger than just you or me. It's bigger than him." I looked up, and at that moment, Thomas walked into the room. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze flicking between Lucas and me. He had clearly overheard Lucas's last words. "What's this about?" he asked evenly, though there was steel in his tone. I stood, trying to explain, but Lucas spoke first. "I'm telling her how much she means to me," he said with that maddening smirk that made my stomach knot. Thomas frowned. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked Lucas, his voice hardening. "What do you mean by that?" "No jokes, Dad," Lucas replied. "You've been away, and we've had time to get to know each other better." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. "Thomas, that's not true," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. "He's trying to manipulate you, to turn you against me." "Manipulate?" Lucas laughed, a cold, biting sound. "You knew where this was headed. It's just time to be honest now." "Lucas, shut up," I shouted, losing control. "Thomas, listen to me. This is his game, his manipulation. He's doing this on purpose." But Thomas was already looking at me, and the warmth that once filled his eyes was gone. He looked at me as though seeing me for the first time, and the silence between us was unbearable. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The truth. Only the truth." I opened my mouth to explain, but Lucas cut in again. "The truth?" he said, his tone smooth, deliberate. "The truth is she's not my stepmother, and you've been too blind to see it." Those words shattered the last threads of trust. Thomas moved suddenly, stepping toward Lucas and grabbing him by the collar, shoving him against the wall. "Is that true?" he shouted at me, his voice full of rage. "No!" I cried, my voice cracking. "It's not true! He's lying about everything!" Despite being pinned, Lucas remained unnervingly calm, like a predator who knew the hunt was already over. Thomas let go of Lucas abruptly and turned away, walking to the window. He stood with his back to me, his shoulders rising and falling heavily. Then he spoke, his words slicing through the air like a blade. "Both of you, leave. Tonight." "Thomas, please, listen to me." I rushed to him, but he raised a hand, cutting me off. "Leave. I don't want to see either of you again." His words left me hollow, as if the life had been drained from me. Lucas, passing by on his way out, gave me that same infuriating look, satisfied, detached, as if he had achieved exactly what he set out to do.